Choose a Gentle Winding Path, an essay on ethical choice, part 3. This is chapters 6 and 7 by Marty Price, copyright 2022 Marty E.G. Price. Chapter 6, Ourselves and the Economic World. Moving on to our social interactions, to life with neighbors, or more specifically, life with those we interact with economically. At this point, I throw away my bit of Marx, as from each according to his ability rather quickly becomes a rationale for exploitation once we've stepped into the economic sphere. George Orwell provides the example in Animal Farm as Bosco, the workhorse, is worked to death for the good of society. He is exploited until his strength is gone and then sent off to the glue factory. Expropriation of one's talents, be they great or ordinary, without just reward is hardly respect for freedom and dignity. The demand that one give oneself to a less than noble cause is hardly the path to self-actualization. How about from each according to his or her own designs, to each according to her or his contributions? In ideal form, that sounds very nice. Once one compensates for the handicaps and limitations of some, the disabilities of others, that sounds both fair and just. People are rewarded for their contributions to society, food, crafts, teaching, all and sundry, and are allowed free choice in their occupation and contribution. It also sounds very like capitalism, and it is. That is the ideal, pretty image of capitalism that graces the eye of economic theorists. Guess what? It does not work. It does not work because the goal of capitalism is not for everyone to have enough. The goal is never self-actualization. The goal is not a world of philosophers or artists or even contented working folk resting after the evening meal. The goal is mammon, the accumulation of wealth. And few things are less conducive to ethical riches than the pursuit of worldly riches. One works. By the infamous Puritan work ethic, one measures one's life by work. One gathers wealth and keeps it from one's neighbors. One hoards. One is tempted, sorely tempted, to gain wealth by whatever means necessary. Theft is, in some circles, good as long as one gets away with it. Are there many things more dehumanizing, more debasing, more exploitative of others than financial cheating? Treating others as means to gather money without contribution, utilizing the mechanism of supply and demand to minimize the compensation given others, such as wages, and maximize the profits on one's own property, prices. Using supply and demand to make property much more valuable than labor, and making one's way in the world by manipulating property. Reducing foodstuffs, the necessity of all, to a means to gather excessive capital. Economics are necessary that we can maintain our lives. Economics, however, always sit at the right hand of mammon. Always there are those without sufficient human values, those who readily sell their souls to mammon. When the appeasement of mammon becomes a social end, when the worship of mammon is, more than justified, glorified, ethical behavior is impossible. One cannot treat one's neighbors as an end by robbing him or her of every penny she or he has earned. One cannot treat one's neighbor as an end by ransoming his or her life with medicine costs. When one looks at the high price on one's cheap and plentiful insulin and shrugs, that's economics. That's economics as people struggle to earn enough to keep themselves alive. A vein of fiendish ice appears in one's heart. One who looks at insurance actuarial tables and says, profits are good, is one who has sold off at least a portion of his or her soul. One who mutters about the undeserving poor wastes breath on moral emptiness. It matters little that some poor people may be undeserving when the question is food for a child, shelter from a chilling rain, or life itself. The undeserving poor, granting there may be such, are yet human beings. No human being deserves misery, starvation, or hopelessness. Most of the worst are already victims of themselves. They are past, caught up in vices they cannot escape. For the rest, for all the rest, for that hungry child, that person separated, by whatever circumstances, from opportunity, education, health, understanding, what is to be said? For all it must be said, there but for fortune go I. Our society has obligations to all. It is responsible for the necessities of life for all. The most confused and ineffective among us, those suffering invisible handicaps, folks, as well as overt and obvious ones, are human. The so-called failures among us are human. Even the worst among us are human. Though as I look at some violent and self-centered souls, I wonder how that can be. All, in economic terms, deserve the basics of life, deserve that which is necessary to live a qualitatively acceptable and comfortable life. Then there are those who are, through the hideous inequities of our economic system, stuck in poverty. Those whose very necessary jobs earn inadequate pay. Those who are, without question, exploited. There is no excuse for our acceptance of the notion that workers are mere commodities, and those with the wrong skills are damned to impossible poverty. How then are we to live? Well, we begin by instituting rules. Those that force distribution of the rewards of work to the workers, that reward creators more than thieves, and that minimize the rewards of financial manipulators, advertisers, and all such people whose tasks are directly geared to gathering the fruits of mammon. Yes, capitalism must be intensely regulated. Regulation is neither theft nor communism. Regulation is the attempt to deal with the ethical and pragmatic reality that capitalism, unfettered, is neither fair nor pragmatically utilitarian nor just. Gathering money does not contribute to social welfare, nor is it, in itself, a self-actualizing task. Excessive hoarding is, depending on circumstances, either a desperate reach for security or pure and simple theft. Ideally, if we were all perfect people, there would be no such concerns. One would determine fair prices by the efforts put forth by others, and always give and receive fair value. We are not perfect people. We can be ethical ones and attempt to structure a society in which all receive fair rewards and all are encouraged to share the best of themselves, whether the rewards be rich or meager. We can dream of replacing dysfunctional economic systems with social systems that try to be fair. Moneyless systems do not work because we differ in wants, needs, and ambitions. Moneyless systems cannot accommodate all our varied priorities. The earthly examples we have seen include some which destroy freedom, dignity, and human life. Cambodia in the Pol Pot years, China during Mao's Cultural Revolution, and other such attempts, voluntary ones, have collapsed in the face of human laziness and ego. The transcendentalist Brook Farm Commune and Fruitland Commune both suffered from members who imagined their important, deep thought was a better use of their time than sharing in planting, building, harvesting, and such mundane and ordinary tasks. Eating dinner, for those of us possessing reason, is something of a priority, and sharing in the creation of dinner is responsible behavior. Great philosophers, or those who imagine themselves such, seem particularly adept at not understanding mundane necessity. A few idealistic communities, such as the religious baked shaker community, that died from their celibacy requirement following a long, successful life, were exceptions. One will note that the Shakers had a commitment to something beyond an individual's deep thought. One will also note that the Shakers participated in the greater economic world, trading with and selling to the outside world. Humans, it seems, are not good at sharing, at least not when we interact at a greater than a village level. And humans are lazy and ego-driven, except when we work to be otherwise. Large social systems and economic necessity seem at odds with ethical behavior. We have progressed far enough to recognize the question, and that is something of an accomplishment. For more than a few of the so-called civilized centuries of our short history, the notion that the powerful should exploit the rest went largely unchallenged. Autocrats and their lackeys, with armies to support them, habitually stole all they could. We recognize that as wrong. We must find ways to go further. Ethics demands we create a fairer world. Chapter 7. Others, animal mostly, with whom we share our world. In the dear world of knots that seems my early focus, thou shalt not exploit thy neighbor should perhaps be accompanied by the very direct, thou shalt not shoot thy neighbor. In general terms, decent ethics begin with injunctions against doing harm to one's neighbor. That all seems simple enough, but raises the question, who is my neighbor? We should not forget that is a real question. As mentioned, clan thought and village thought separates us from other. We, as can be discerned in the recovered notions of a wide range of people, have a long history of separating us from them. Dependent on circumstances, one is invited to deceive, betray, steal from, enslave, or murder those not neighbors. Stealing and enslaving their womenfolk, for women were so generally regarded as property, was a morally desirable thing, as a Plains Indian would find stealing horses. That is an act of courage, a virtue, rather than a crime. What makes an outsider worthy of a higher moral regard than a bison? Well, I will get to that, but perhaps we might begin with the bison, or a sheep, or an olive tree. How should we ethically interact with animals and plants? Much is often made of the romanticist claim that indigenous people had respect for the creatures they turned into dinner. Some evidence indicates did. Some, however, did not. Think of such European entertainments as bear baiting. Think of the games in the Colosseum of Rome. I suppose Romans and pre-Enlightenment Europeans were not particularly respectful in their behavior, but I'm not certain just who was. I'm not going to venture into territory outside my ken and start measuring whether a gift to the gods after a successful hunt reflected respect for the creature being dined on, or just superstitious terror of a divinity who might withhold success in the next hunt if not properly placated. When I examine cultures that indulged in human sacrifice, when I see a strangled victim in a peat bog, I am hard-pressed to call animal sacrifice a symbol of respect for the animal. Instead, I see sacrifice of meat or grain as a gift to some animist deity who must be placated, with human and sacrifice a more extreme and uglier form of the same. So let us examine our neighbor who walks on four legs, or 6 or 8, or none at all. With our neighbor who generates food through photosynthesis instead of eating other neighbors, and even our neighbor who sits on the carcass of animal or vegetable, behaving as the fungus it is. Some folks, out of respect for the animals as they measure respect, eat only vegetables. And some of those attempt to eat only the fruit, seeds, and nuts of plants, attempting to offer respect to all growing things. That is their choice, and I will not question their designs. I prefer their measure to those who would sacrifice. One gives gifts to the gods by measures that encourage life, measures of generosity and love, not by murdering to share a kill. My own response, I fear, is different, though. I wish to acknowledge that all these beings are alive, yet I compromise by behavior toward them quite completely. I examine the function of the plant cycles of life, finding that the planet operates by a system of balance. Plants produce oxygen by the same process with which they build their own bodies. Animals consume oxygen as well as organic food matter. They exhale carbon dioxide, which the plants require for their little internal factories. There is a balance, or rather a spinning, whirling imbalance, a self-regulating, unkempt spiral, always spinning back onto itself. The food chain is the same. Everything eats everything. Consequently, I, under the limitations of my own diet and system, am allowed to eat everything, so to speak. I may harvest plants if my designs are not wasteful. I may eat the fish and flesh and fowl that walk the earth. I have the right to eat. I have, however, by the injunctions I have stated, the obligation to treat my dinner, and everything else that wanders this planet, with respect. Despite our status as omnivores, we do not eat everything. Our preferred meat sources are several herbivores, and meat and animal derivatives are about 30% of an average natural diet. The rest of the diet, including plant and plant products. Our nutritional requirements and digestive system are happiest, to my understanding, with such a mixed diet. We are, however, quite adaptive to both much higher animal product diets and to diets without animal products, provided we understand, consciously or by instinct, foods we need to make such diets complete. Have we the right to kill that which we have no intention of eating, or otherwise utilize to enhance our survival? My vociferous no is tempered by my hostility to certain creatures who would impose on my environment or would do me harm. I do not want rats in my kitchen, in my grain, or anywhere else I can manage to get rid of them. I prefer that poisonous snakes know their place, and their place is not where I intend to tread. We do not need too many alligators. I can fight with some ecologists over what is too many alligators. We do not need invasive species, those that destroy an ecosystem. So, I fear, there are all sorts of creatures whose members I will not treat with much respect. I have no right to torment or torture them, but I will assert, in the name of my own life, freedom, and dignity, my right to remove them from places they are less than welcome. I would enthusiastically remove all Burmese pythons from the Florida Everglades, and note that it is the fault of irresponsible humans that particular or dangerous non-native snake is there. It is different when the creatures were there first, when we may be the less than welcome intruders. Sometimes we are in competition, elements of nature red in tooth and claw. And it is time for subtle measures, for determining just where my rights and those of a rabbit stand in terms of my garden. In most cases, I bow to everything eats everything and declare extreme measures ethically permissible as I defend my meals to be. But which extreme measures are allowed? The question takes on many elements. When does a trap become a device of torture rather than a necessary means of defense? What are the unintended effects of so many poisons, with ecological effects far beyond the slaying of specific invading rabbits? Whether the question involves rabbits, moles, deer, or even a wandering bison in my garden, wolves discovering my sheep, or polar bears who decide I just might taste good, ethics demands that we, as a society, create ecologically healthy boundaries for response. I will manifestly advocate my right not to be eaten by a polar bear, but there are times when my response, legally and morally obligated, is to stay out of the polar bear's way rather than attempt to harm the creature. We make laws establishing preserves. We declare delineated seasons to reduce deer populations. We protect the rare species and dine on plentiful ones. That is all good and ethical, part of our participation in the complex ecosystem of the planet. Hunting for food is good, provided the practice is ecologically sound and undertaken by humane means. All species have the right to eat, to live, and to thrive, my own and all the rest. All individuals hold the right to life, but with the caveat that life involves mortality, that all of us are on the way to someone's dinner table, even us humans, though contemporary burial practices include preposterous measures to preserve our no longer useful carcasses. Hunting for sport? I find the sport appalling. I have no reason to deprive any living creature of life except as a necessary, or at least desirable, addition to my dinner table. I would, without hesitation, shoot a deer, a bison, or a caribou if I were possessed of the means to dress it for the table and, without waste, dine on it. As for murdering a giraffe, we use the term murder with all direct intent. We do not normally eat giraffe, and I have yet to see an account of any human killed by a giraffe. I find the stalking and slaying of an animal for no intention, and except to claim a trophy, an offense against planet Earth and its very fabric. Every creature, no less than ourselves, is entitled to life, dignity, and freedom. For all that life entails competition and those elements of death, none of us ever have the right to wantonly, maliciously, or callously take the life of another creature. We must not kill without need. Are zoos compatible with my notions of freedom? It depends on the zoo, for an animal may be quite happy, or at least satisfied, in a comfortable, controlled environment. I'm not concerned about the existential fulfillment of the desire to hunt as experienced by a captive lion, but would be very concerned about a captive environment, a cage, that impairs the lion's ability to find joy. A lion needs other lions in most cases. It needs space to run. It needs the afternoon sun that it may lazily doze. To indulge our desires to safely interact with, or view, other creatures is harmless, provided we do no harm in either acquiring or keeping the creatures. If our means, murderous gathering, claustrophobic caging, painful training, is flawed, our ends, gee, we get to see the gorilla, are flawed and illegitimate. If our means are acceptable, humane, gentle, harmless, then our end, look at the cute penguins, stand on their own merits, and we may smile as a penguin playfully splashes us. Keeping domestic animals is another issue. People who argue against keeping pets are animal haters, not animal lovers. We, our species, have carried on symbiotic relationships with dogs and cats for thousands of years. Friendships, real friendships, between members of the canine species and ourselves have a longer history than our written history. We share affection, we share love, we share responsibility. The story with the horse is a different one. Presently, most of our relationships with domestic horses are for mutual pleasure or for sport. As for the latter, horse racing, I have not enough understanding of the curious sport to comment on it, but I fear it is rather like the sport of American football. There are elements of it the participants love, but it is both dangerous and exploitive. I am not inclined to watch horse racing, partly because it involves curious rites of mammon, that is, gambling, and partly because the sport is, at least in some cases, cruel to the horses. For the rest, contemporary horses, domestic ones, generally live good lives. As for wild horses, horses are quite capable of thriving in the wild, and those doing so should receive the same respect as any other wild grazing beast. Our history with horses is, I fear, a less positive one. Prior to the European Industrial Revolution, horses were a means of transportation, the machines of much heavy work, plowing, creatures ridden into battles which they neither began nor understood, and creatures abused by various forms of industry. Horses were as capable of loving and being loved in those days as today. Many a horse was well cared for. Many a horse was as much a family member and domestic partner as a dog. But many a horse was abused, exploited, worked to death, slaughtered in those mentioned wars, treated only as a means and never as an end, the reverse of that Kantian injunction. We are a cruel species, historically, and too often treated our domestic partners as badly as each other. If our partnerships with dogs tend to reflect positively on our species, our relationships with cats, often the victims of sadistic attacks, and horses, exploited, abused, reduced to mere machines, reveal us as, in too many cases, a less than empathetic species. Then there are those domestic species we keep, generally not as friends, but as sources of food. We grow our meat, just as we grow our vegetables and grains. I refuse to foray into questions of ethical treatment of domestic plants except as an ecological issue. I assume that if one mistreats a plant, it will die, leaving the issue resolved in a rather simple manner. There are, however, various ways of mistreating domestic animals that are advantageous in either adherence to the values of mammon or producing desired food products. As for the creatures involved, no, they are not going to effect an escape on the order of the chickens in the Aardman cartoon Chicken Run. Some may whimper and cry, some may die, but with the limitations of our taste buds, our dinner table does not differentiate between a happy cow and an unhappy one. This despite the carnation, milk from contented cows, billboards I saw as a child. Ethically, then, is our factory farm system tolerable? Many say no. Some purchase from family farmers, some look for free-range labels on eggs and meat, and pay extra for the hopefully more humane treatment of the animals. Some choose vegetarian diets, not in objection to all meat eating, but in objection to the means by which we produce our meat products. Regardless of the appropriateness of our participation in the food chain, our treatment of food animals falls far short on any ethical scale. The vast majority of us, myself included, through indifference, if not involvement, treat food and dairy animals badly.